On behalf of the Center for Advanced Studies, I would like to welcome you to today's event in the CAS Lecture Series Extreme Heat, the Planetary Future. My name is Lena Bouman. I'm the academic coordinator for the Natural Science and Medicine here at the center. Temperature records, tropical nights, and heat waves. As a result of climate change, heat extremes are becoming more frequent. At the opening event of the lecture series, we heard from Carsten Friedrich, an expert from the German Weather Service, that the number of hot days and tropical nights has increased significantly since the 80s. And unfortunately, this trend will continue. Annette Peters, epidemiologist from the LMU and the Helmholtz Center, was the second speaker on the podium and discussed together with Carsten Friedrich and moderator Christina Berndt from the SZ the effects of extreme heat on human health. At last week's panel discussion, we looked at the consequences of extreme heat for the water ecosystem. Martin Grambo, former head of the Department of Water Management and Soil Protection at the Bavarian State Ministry, and geographer Matthias Garschhagen, together with Ralf Ludwig, who's sitting over there, discussed how to make the landscape more resilient and counteract dryness and flooding. At today's event, we want to address migration and inequality due to climate change. To this end, we have invited two extremely interesting high-profile experts. The social scientist Libertad Chávez Rodríguez from the CIESAS Research Centre for Social Anthropology in Mexico. She's also currently fellow here at CAS. And Silja Klepp, professor of human geography at the University of Kiel. I won't tell you any more because Eveline Dürr will be introducing them in a moment. Eveline Dürr will also moderate the discussion. But of course, I don't want to miss the opportunity to thank all three panelists for their willingness to take part in this discussion. I would also like to briefly mention our next event in this lecture series. On January 13th, political scientist Miranda Schroers from the Technical University and psychologist Philipp Sprengholz from the University of Bamberg will talk with Constanze Rossmann about government measures and communication strategies with regard to climate change. And with that, I would like to hand over to Eveline Dürr and wish you all a very exciting event and an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Lena, for your warm welcome, and also a very warm welcome from my side. I'm very happy to see such an illustrious crowd and young faces and students and senior colleagues together to discuss our topic tonight. My name is Eveline Dürr, as Lena already mentioned, and I am delighted to guide you through this evening, and I'm particularly happy to introduce our distinguished guests. Escaping the heat global scenario of migration and inequality, we will discuss this topic from a social sciences perspective with a focus on the many different ways different people are differently affected by climate change. And we will place emphasis on their strategies and agency this evening. Their decision, for instance, to migrate are by no means random, but shaped by wider structural conditions and political context which intertwine with the effects of climate change. Migration as a way to escape the heat, for instance, is one important practice which is closely related to the other keyword in our title, that is inequality. Inequality refers not only to socio-economic status, but also to intersectional categories such as class, gender, and ethnicity, but also beyond these more typical categories, we would stress that they are also tied in the uneven relationships between the so-called global north and global south. All these topics are not straightforward, but contradictory and controversial, while also politically charged and emotionally loaded, as we can see in many daily conversations or in the media in particularly. So I'm really extremely grateful to have two experts here tonight with us who will engage in a discussion with one another and with us as audience addressing some of these really important issues. I will now first introduce our first speaker, which is Silja Klepp. She's a professor of human geography at the Christian Albrechts University in Kiel, and she received her doctoral degree from the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle and worked as a postdoc in the Artec Research Centre for Sustainability in Bremen. She's a member of the Academy of Sciences and Humanities in Hamburg, and she's also a member of the European Academy of Sciences, and she holds currently the UNESCO Chair for Integrated Marine Sciences. I think those are really three major awards and distinctions for her engaged work. Her research focuses on oceans and coasts, including Europe, Africa, but also Oceania, with projects on island states such as Kiribati, Vanuatu, New Zealand. She's also interested in interdisciplinary work on the Anthropocene and socio-ecological transformations more broadly, and she applies artistic work as a means of science communication. She asks which justice implications climate governance has in terms of adaptation and mitigation, and currently she works on erosion of coasts in Sicily and investigates how adaptation to climate change actually looks like, and we will hear more about this also in her presentation. Our second speaker is Libertad Chávez Rodríguez. As we already heard, she comes to us from Mexico, from the CIESAS, which translates as the Center for Research and Advanced Studies in Social Anthropology in the northern part of Mexico in Monterrey. However, Libertad has very strong linkages to Germany, and she's absolutely top super fluent in German. So if you have problems addressing the Q&As in English, we are of course also very happy to take German questions, which we would be able to translate, but it's not necessary because she's spot on in German as well. So no worries for that. She has strong links to Germany for several reasons. One is she received her PhD from the Arctic Research Centre for Sustainability in Bremen in social sciences and critical sustainability studies, and she held various visiting professorships, for instance, at the University in Kiel. She's a member of several activist networks in Mexico and also internationally, such as Académics de Monterrey 43, combating in particular state violence. This is a very particular issue in Mexico, and she's also a member of the international Gender CC Women for Climate Justice Network. Her research interests focuses on gender, which is a much needed perspective, and she asked what role gender plays in the ways people are affected by climate change, in particular in cities. So her focus is not so much on coasts and oceans, but on urban issues. So I think it's very interesting to see those two very different areas in comparison and in contrast to one another this evening. Applying a political ecology approach, she's interested in vulnerability, environmental justice, as well as in coping and adaptation strategies of individuals in the face of environmental catastrophes, such as floods and other consequences of global warming. With these two speakers, we bring together expertise from different regional contexts and socioeconomic and political settings to discuss people's life worlds in the Anthropocene from a social sciences angle. Tonight, we place emphasis on the agency of individuals, their structural embeddedness and positionalities, as well as their practices and the ways they relate meaningfully to their changing environment. So I would like to invite Silja as our very first speaker to present some of her ideas.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Eveline Dürr, for this amazing invitation in this very interesting space. I'm very curious to see what will happen this evening. I put here also the brackets to underline a little bit what you already mentioned, that maybe there are no global scenarios for climate mobility, but that we are rather looking for local and regional perspectives, maybe also for the solutions, if there might be solutions for climate migrants, or to find innovative ways of dealing with climate mobility. So, so for my input, I will do a very short reflection on the research field as such. And then I will go into a case study in Kiribati, and then as an outlook, I will also briefly speak about my research in Sicily. So why is research on climate mobility actually so complicated? It is a very interdisciplinary and also rapidly growing research field. And many disciplines are involved here, from ecology to the humanities, from biology to history, even theology. So we can see nearly all disciplines in the field. But research here consists also of much grey literature and contract research. So for example, NGOs and international organizations are also publishing a lot in this field. And they're actually often also connecting their political interests to the topic. And this might be often also problematic because it overloads a very complex phenomenon with sometimes simplistic political messages. And often it describes also environmental migrants as the human face of climate change. Then environmental migration and climate change migration is often also not differentiated, even if we speak of earthquake migrants, for example. So it's all often then a bit mixed up, and a complex research field becomes sometimes too simplistic. This means that research on climate change mobility is also highly contested. For example, due to the inconsistent terminology. So we have actually no joint definition, and there are also very different research approaches and methodologies. And the debate has always been touched also upon the categorization of environmental migrants that implies different political and normative standpoints. So here the question is, are these people refugees? Then of course they are in need of international protection, or they get international protection. Or is it environmentally induced migration, which is a completely different discussion. So there are different normative questions that are connected to the research field. And we find these different questions also in the methodology, because it's such an interdisciplinary field. We have very different methods, from scenario building to empirical, quantitative, but of course also a lot of qualitative methods. And what is also very interesting, that our findings from the empirical studies are often counterintuitive. So for example, we have foresight reports that underline that environmental change can render individuals or communities even less mobile because of environmental degradation, because they have no resources anymore to migrate. This is also why many studies actually say that it is not possible to reliably predict numbers of environmental and climate migrants. But these numbers are actually still a very important feature of the debate. So regarding law, the proposals come actually from a multitude of actors, also from scholars, that bring drafts and legal treaties into the discussion, and also soft law approaches. But recently we have to say that the debate has rather been concentrated on policy-oriented solutions, often on a regional level, and we have a legal protection gap. There's no global or even actually regional binding treaties for climate migrants on a global level. That leads us to the point that we have very different framings of the debate, from an issue of security, climate justice, human rights, or humanitarian issue. And often these framings are also not presented in a very transparent way, I would say. Many papers just set the framing and they don't reflect on it. So my point is, if I think about what is maybe missing in the debate, I would say that it's power-sensitive research on climate change and migration, and generally on the social and cultural effects of climate change, that we need visions for a future under conditions of climate change that avoid one-sided victimization and bleak pictures, and that develop actually visions together with the people affected that are also based on self-determination and not only on victimization. I think also that we need a form of or more ontological pluralism, and by this I mean a plurality actually of methods and perspectives and visions, and that means of course that we are including the perspectives of the people affected very much, and also very different worldviews, and that we also work with the plurality of methods and perspectives. Now you will not be maybe surprised that I, with my research, actually sort of tried to do something like that. So my field research in Oceania, in Kiribati, was based on, I say Kiribati because TI becomes S in the local Kiribati language. And I did ethnographic research in Kiribati in 2011, in Kiribati and Fiji in 2015 and in 2018. Here you see a map. You see that it's many islands, 32 islands, atoll islands actually, in the Pacific. It has 110,000 inhabitants, and as most Pacific islands, it is characterized by a governance and law system that includes aspects of Western style government and traditional law. So we have a situation of legal pluralism, and we have actually 99% of indigenous people in Kiribati, and of indigenous worldviews, indigenous ontologies. Here, for example, I had the honor to work with the master navigator Tulelua, that had very interesting views also on climate change, actually. Regarding Kiribati and climate change, we can say that today observable climate change effects are contested, but low-lying atoll islands are vulnerable due to sea level rise, but also due to more severe storms and freshwater lands that is at risk beneath the islands. And we even have scenarios for Kiribati that it might be uninhabitable within 30 to 50 years, which of course is a very strong prediction for a country. Kiribati was actually the first country to develop a concrete migration strategy for all citizens. That was done by the former President Anote Tong. That was also when I did my research there. And he actually developed a research strategy that I found very innovative, and where I also where we discussed sort of a pioneer role. But since 2016, the new president, Taneth Mamau, he's more concentrating on in situ adaptation and mitigation aspects also. On the contrary to Anote Tong, who made actually also his country very known for this migration strategy, and also for saying we will be the first victims of climate change, which was also contested in the country. So migrate with dignity actually is considered as an adaptation strategy. People don't want to be refugees, so it's not about a refugee status. They know that refugees don't have a strong lobby. Migrate on merit and with dignity was the main slogan of President Tong. It can be understood as a motto with advertising appeal, a development policy, and a strategy to find viable solutions for climate change migrants. And what was very interesting, or what is very interesting about this strategy, that it includes the relocation of whole communities, which is quite unique, and individual migration, and also an education strategy that they also called upskilling of the population. So under the label of climate change migration, Kiribati and Anote Tong were actually negotiating labor programs, migration programs with New Zealand and Australia. For example, the Pacific Access category, where a yearly quota of Pacific Islanders from Tuvalu, Tonga, and Kiribati can migrate to New Zealand. 75 families, under 45, if possible, well educated. And then with Australia, also with New Zealand, they have the recognized seasonal employment program, which is seasonal fruit picking and packaging work, but has also included a long-term perspective for permanent immigration, unlike in the European Union, for example. And we had also with Australia programs where nurses were educated, for example, in Australia. And then what is very interesting, I find, is that there was this deal with Fiji, where Kiribati bought land from the Anglican Church in Fiji, negotiating also with the government of Fiji that in case of emergency, as it was said in Parliament, Fiji would welcome the Kiribati and relocate them to this land that I visited also in my research in Fiji. And we can actually discuss if there are actually new forms of Pacific solidarity that are referring to post-colonial ideas that want to overcome national borders, so to say, and want to see the Pacific as a room of free movement and a sea of islands, like the post-colonial thinker Epeli Haufa mentioned. And I think this is really, something that we don't have much in the debate so far. So some of my conclusions from this research were that the debate is deeply entangled with questions of our time, like North-South relations, inclusion and exclusion, of course, climate justice, that regional negotiations might be more promising than global approaches, that migrate with dignity shows other possibilities, maybe an out-of-the-box thinking that we really need for climate change solutions that might be not only thought within national ideas and within our pathways that we have so far, but that are really going out of the box. And this is actually also what a decentering of the debate means, to learn from the global south. And here Oceania then could be actually a forerunner, and Kiribati could be seen as the forerunner in the debate, and not as a victim, as the island states are often so far looked at. No? Now a very, very brief outlook on my current research, which is really totally different. So I work in Sicily now. I came back to Sicily with my research because, on the contrary to Oceania, you have nearly none social science research on climate change and climate change adaptation. In Sicily, actually none. But you have a lot in Kiribati where 100,000 people are living. So it's also a little bit to bring this research back to Europe and say, this is our problem, of course, as well. And we really also have to develop just adaptation solutions in Europe, especially in the Mediterranean. And what I found is actually a lot of concrete and a lot of very little adaptation discourse, actually. I was a bit surprised by this, but because adaptation today is often also a way of finding new funds, new money, for example, also to build new seawalls. but in Sicily this discourse so far was not very established. In this research, I asked myself, for myself as a social science researcher, what might transformative research approaches mean? And so what might be my role as a researcher also in all this? And the idea was to speak about different perspectives on the coastal erosion, because so far it's only discussed in terms of engineering and natural science. And the idea was we have to speak of coastal erosion in terms of cultural, political, and social aspects, because a lot of funds go into this concrete. And of course, a lot of not only experts, but also mafia, and everybody's gaining from it. So the idea was to bring a dialogue on all this with arts. And I have the big luck to work with the photographer Barbara Dombrowski. And we developed this exhibition together on interrelated crises in the Anthropocene, where the burning forests are actually also really interrelated with the eroding coasts, because people are moving from the mountains to the sea, and the landscapes are not the forests in the mountains are not cleaned anymore. So the fires can really develop very fast, and the eroding coasts, of course, because all the coastal sprawl and very little planning and a lot of building activities. So yeah. So very recently, together we could open this exhibition in Sicily, and we were really happy to see that it actually really, provoked some dialogue and maybe also some different perspectives. Thank you very much. And now I'm very happy to pass over to my colleague, Libertad Chávez.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Also from my side, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you to Eveline for the kind introduction and for the invitation, and of course to Lena Bouman also for having me this evening. I'm also very pleased to be a fellow of CIESAS during these days, and of course to share the space with Silja. Well, as Eveline already said, the main question posed to us for the discussion was what are people in the Global South doing, and what are their strategies to deal with climate change. And I'm focusing more, not so much in migration, but more on inequality, on the inequality topic. And by this, well, I think Evelina was meaning which adaptation strategies, what are their life world experiences and practices, and of course I'm speaking from a situated knowledge, considering the perspectives of my own research currently in the northeast of Mexico. Well, I also changed a little bit the topic to escaping the flood, and then a question mark, and local scenarios of migration and inequality, because I also think there are local scenarios, of course, and every case is different. Well, I would like to briefly present some of the results of a project on differentiated social vulnerability to hydrometeorological hazards in the city of Monterrey, Mexico, conducted from 21 to 24. I will start from the other side. I will present the case and then some reflections on the results. And these projects focus on issues of risk perception, coping, adaptation, and survival practices to recurrent floods in the context of climate change. I did ethnographic work in 3 neighborhoods located in the slope of the Topo Chico Hill, which are identified as prone to flooding, surface runoff, and also waterlogging areas. Just to give you an idea, Monterrey is there, where this little band is 5.7 million inhabitants in 18 municipalities, a big city. It's the 3rd largest city in Mexico. And Well, the research interests of these projects were to explore practices of coping and adaptation to recurring phenomena, especially seasonal rainfall, tropical storms, and hurricanes, to examine the role of attachment to place in household decision-making, about settlement, permanence, and relocation, and also in forms of individual and community resistance and collective organization in the search for environmental justice at community level. The wide aim of this project is to go beyond technical studies. This is a coincidence with Celia's work, to go beyond technical studies for the identification of risk zones in geophysical and demographic terms, which is quite common, and doing this by conducting research from the perspective of the affected people and affected households on the determinants on their strategies. And also to incorporate, as Eveline said, the analysis of gender and intersectionality perspectives in the study of social vulnerability. And the initial question I was asking myself is why people stray in places that are currently flooded every year, even by seasonal rainings, even when they could find other places to settle or resettle. So I'm quite looking at the materiality of flood risk and climate change adaptation practices in everyday life in my work. And I'm particularly interested in the role of place attachment for decision making, what is sometimes called micro disasters. So these disasters that are maybe not in the media every time, but that happen to many people and in a common basis. And for the analysis, I relied theoretically in the intersectional risk theory that states, very shortly said, that risks and inequalities are mutually constitutive and mutually reinforcing. And I apply the notions that emerge from this theory as analytical tools for reading and interpreting everyday practices and coping and adaptation strategies. While doing risk refers to the experience experience and assume the risk of long-term permanence and continuity of daily life in areas prone to flooding, which can be explained by the deep sense of attachment to the place, as well as by this materiality of the precarious living conditions of these zones, bringing few opportunities for relocation. Redoing risk means adding new risks to daily life, such as problems with the sanitary drainage that reinforces risk or the permanence of the next generation in flood-prone areas. So I'm not going to go into detail of this, but just to give you an idea what is the problematic. And then ongoing risk refers to actions and measures towards eliminating or lessening risk, expressed in this case through community accomplishment of infrastructural measures such as demanding the introduction of a storm drainage or underground control of rainwater in the main street, which was originally a natural rainwater downstream, which is very important. And another very important element in the project is an intersectional approach on environmental justice, which means addressing the distribution of goods and harms, as well as the justice of procedure, justice of participation and recognition in decision taking, not only in terms of space and time, but also the distribution of goods and harms by gender and age, indicators of racialization and ethnicity and socioeconomic levels, which bring us to the idea of intersectionality. And well, the idea behind is that there cannot be environmental justice without gender justice, or the idea that gender justice is also social justice. Well, I'm coming to the results very briefly, and I organized the results in these 3 topics, but I only will concentrate on the second one. Well, the practices and experiences with floods entail constructive measures and also non-constructive measures. I won't go into detail, but you can have like an idea like how they cope in their everyday life. And these are like infrastructural measures. But I would like to highlight the role of self-construction as a determinant for staying in those places and for a strong place attachment, and also the role of community organization to resist and to adapt to flood risks. Well, the majority of these houses were constructed by their habitants over the time, sometimes involving 3 or 4 generations, frequently in various stages, starting from a very little house or very easy materials, depending on the economic possibilities and needs for space in the households. The analysis of the material on self-constructions also points out to a significant role of place attachment and how this is linked to the doing and redoing of risks. People who have built their homes themselves have a strong sense of attachment to place, according to my results, and hardly consider relocation or abandonment of their community. Well, in addition to this central role of self-construction, the results reveal also the role played by other components of place attachment. For example, affection for place developed as a result of memories, and also experience of long life trajectories, and also functional ties to place, which are also important to make possible labor, and also the maintenance and reproduction of life, also care work also, which is also very important in terms of a gender perspective. And well, finally I come to the results on community resistance to risks. Well, the pressing needs for provision of basic services led these communities to organize and resist throughout their history as neighbors, building up a strong collective identity and social cohesion. This is really clear. They assert that the great part of the infrastructure was obtained through social participation, and they also highlight the participation of women in community work, especially. And also the central problem of flooding persists nowadays, but they try to find solutions to this situation. No? For example, right now this storm drainage system is working and were concluded by January 2024, also this year, but they still claim for a proper functioning of the system as the surface runoff persists and was clearly visible in the last rainfalls during Storm Albert in June 2024. Well, I will just come to some concluding remarks. Well, my research, my analysis tries to contribute to ongoing discussions on intersectionality of risks and social inequalities by problematizing risk as concept in this context, especially considering that there are few examples of intersectional analysis of risk in the Global South. They are concentrated more in Scandinavia, I will say, but also in North Europe. And also adding to the notion, the idea is to add the notion of place and the analysis of place attachment in relation to doing risks, which tries to contribute to understanding of the materialities of risk, in particular context and of decisions that are supposedly beyond rationality or explanation in the face of risk. Not that these people are normally stigmatized as squatters or as ignorant people or lazy people that they don't want to move. And I was looking for deeper explanations or deeper motivations to understand this. And well, I think it's quite clear that this study case in Monterrey I was presenting makes visible how complex the effects of this disorderly, chaotic, and inconsistent expansion of the urban-rural frontier, which is present in many Mexican cities and also in many Latin American cities, as you might know, and how this expansion has evolved since the beginning of these human settlements processes of environmental injustices that intersect with access of power and prevailing social inequalities. And there's a clear link also to the approach of violence, different forms of violence, for example, infrastructural violence, symbolic violence, and also slow violence, especially in the face of the expected impacts of global climate change. And also to other approaches, as I mentioned before, like the approach of micro-disasters that are not mediatic, but representing big losses for the personal well-being, and not only the present personal well-being, but also the opportunities in the future. No? That's for the new generations or for the people affected. By exploring these practices through the lens of intersectional risk theory and the conceptual notions that emerge from it, it's possible to focus this idea of blaming these people, no? Often found in explanations of our decisions to remain in places with recurrent flood risks, and also opening space for research collaborators to raise their own voices, no? And the idea is to contribute to deconstruct their social stigmatization, as I said, and also the stigmatization of these places as illegal human settlements, which were once and now legalized or regularized. Well, on the contrary, the results, the empirical results demonstrate a life of work and effort, of individual struggles, and also collective resistance to reduce risk, and in the long term to doing risk away. Their decision-making is conscious, guided by deep motivations associated with identity, shaped in these places, also with the value they give to what they have built with their own hands, and also with the cognitive and affective ties to place and to their communities and families, and not just inevitably determined by economic, political, and gender power structures. The results show that place attachment is an important factor in decision-making and coping strategies, and it should be therefore taken in account by disaster risk management, and also it's important in the collective organization for claiming distributive environmental justice as well as justice of recognitions, as citizens, for example, in urban regular settlements, looking to leave behind these social stigmas as migrants, as invaders, or squatters. And finally, maybe this is a point of connection with Celia. This idea or this notion of agency, this is present, the notion of agency, but at the same time, structural issues about the quality of public infrastructure, also suspicions of corruption, governmental negligence or inefficiency at all levels of government are salient or emerge. And in these cases, at least from a feminist perspective of the idea or the notion of victimization will be important. No? This discussion on ambivalence of victimization, what are they? Are they victims or are they agents regarding their social vulnerability to environmental hazards become very important, as well as in these studies, on these discussions, as well as in gender and intersectionality studies. Okay, thank you very much. I'll leave it there, and I'm very happy about the discussion. Yeah, thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your input and sharing some of your results and insights with us. Thank you. And I think there was a very obvious tension between the two presentations. In the Pacific, it sounded like a place attachment is non-existent. They can freely move from one island to the next without any problems, and that could be a solution for the problematic that we are facing. Whereas in the Mexican example, we see the opposite, that people are labeled as ignorant. They know the flood will come every year and they still don't move, even though they have many options to move, and the government tries to convince them to go somewhere else to be safe, but it just doesn't happen. So can you talk about this kind of very different approaches to place, obviously? there is no place attachment in the Pacific. I say this now very provocatively, knowing that it's not true. But how would you explain that migration with dignity as an exit strategy that could be successful?
Now, of course, there is a very strong place attachment. But what I found very interesting in Oceania is that the social relations are actually also very much determining space. So if you have, for example, relatives already in New Zealand, then you're more easily moving through maybe the Pacific Access category than if you don't have people there. And of course, in Kiribati, there were a lot of people that didn't want to migrate at all. But there were also people, younger people, also more the well-educated people that said probably it's better to have a future in New Zealand also for our children because we are a small island state, we don't know what the future will bring, maybe climate change will get very, very severe. So there were lots of different discussions. Some even said that Anote Tong should not develop such strategies because they wanted to remain there, and we should rather speak about mitigation. And others were happy to use the Pacific Access category to migrate. But what I think is really interesting is this, that there are aspects that you don't find in other contexts. And this is, for example, the community relocation aspect.
Yeah, and I think that it needs to be stressed that the migration with dignity is something entirely different than migrating without dignity, so to speak. And when we talk about forced migration or the refugee status, which is a very difficult thing. And this brings us to the labeling of migrants. What actually is a migrant, a climate refugee? What are the differences? And I think it's quite important also for legal status. And sometimes in the statistics there is big confusion about economic migrants, which are not seen as legitimate migrants in many places. But if the heat is on and you can't really grow your produce anymore, you are kind of an economic migrant. You're classified as an economic migrant, even so you might also pass as a climate refugee. So that's a very different notion and a very different association that we have with economic migrants than with climate refugees, and the status is very different. So I think that's actually a very important topic for research and labeling, and you address this in your very first part of the presentation when you say there are quite some confusion about categories and how to label people who are mobile because they have to leave their homeland or their island because of climate change. So it's an international debate that I think is quite important in the topic.
And maybe we should also underline that we know that in the future most mobility will happen internally. I mean, often the debates are concentrated on south-north migration, but we know from our empirical research that there will be much more internal migration and even south-south migration.
Yeah,
so this is also.
Yeah, I just want to add to that I recently attended a seminar by Claxo on human mobility and climate change, and well, not really. I'm not really into this topic, but they highlighted very much about this internal mobility, mobility routes. For example, in Mexico, Mexico has been typically a country of transit, but nowadays it's actually a country of destiny, considered as country of destiny. And also, they say that actually there is an under scoring of climate change induced migration because of because it's internal actually. No, it's not. It's not this international migration, and in Monterrey it's also visible. No, that still this movement inside the country are happening. Yeah.
Well, maybe we can also talk a bit about the different settings that we have in your presentation. So one is the island, which is very prominent, and the mobility in the Pacific, of course. And I think it's also tied in a particular imaginary that we have that goes along with islands, which is kind of portrayed in the media as particularly vulnerable with the sea level rise and so forth. And in your research, it's completely different. It's an urban setting. It's one of the biggest cities in Mexico. So how does this impact on patterns of migration or on risk perception? Could you talk about the contrasts that you perceive in your presentations?
Well, I think it's maybe it's also the sea, that is near to, very in the very context of your case study, and in my case, it's more like it's a urban setting.
The coast.
And exactly, the coast, and we are a valley surrounded by mountains, and well, it's a very different geographical setting, of course, but I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, definitely. I think in my case, it was sort of like really an iconic place where I did my research. I came there, I think, a little bit before Kiribati became really an iconic place for climate change, in 2010 for the first time, more or less. But then very soon, many researchers arrived, and also many journalists, to see these victims of climate change. And we have to say that Anote Tong at this time, the former president, really contributed also to this image of Kiribati as first victim of climate change. Of course, we have to say that there are not many nation states that are only atolls, that are only flat land. So when I went out of my house with a king tide, with a monthly king tide, I already had wet feet, yeah? So it's not that half a meter is missing. It's more like this that is missing, that the infrastructure is drowned, because everything is close to the sea, everything is on the coast. Atoll islands have like strips of land of maybe 300-400 meters, sometimes a kilometer, but that's it. So it is probably actually vulnerable. But then what do you do with this? And Anote Tong decided to make his country very outspokenly a place where adaptation money maybe should arrive. So, and he actually succeeded in attracting a lot of attention also from donors. And a lot of money came into the country. Some say that it did not only good to Kiribati, because a lot of money was also invested in different projects that were not always maybe helping the people. Yeah. But and this is maybe the difference also with Monterrey, which is not such an iconic place, but where you also said that the coping strategies are more like mini disaster based.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they are like they said also like they are used to it. They live with the floods, no? That's why I call the project Living with Floods, because they are actually consider themselves as adapted, no? So they said, nowadays rain is under control, and we know how to live with it, and they are really not openly connecting, like the rising up of the problem with climate change. Actually, they said they are more and I think it's an issue of urban planning, or for example the sealing of the soils, which is increasingly visible with the growing of the state, with the urban sprawl, and I really started to consider climate change as a context and a factor that will exacerbate the problem, together with some other issues which are also going on for decades now, no? And
I find that's a very interesting point. So it is not just climate change, or it never was climate change up to a certain point. It was corruption, it was bad planning. There were so many other reasons why flooding was a problem, but it was not climate change. And now kind of the discourse changes. And I think in Kiribati that's a bit of a different story, because the worldwide attention was never on Monterrey and this particular neighborhood. Nobody probably has ever heard about it because it doesn't attract any attention. And I find that very interesting how this interlinks with the perception of people, how they are exposed to what and what are then their coping strategies. Because it's very different if I feel I'm under pressure because the planning is bad, I might fight against bad planning. Or if I feel I'm exposed to risk because of climate change, and I will fight against climate change. I mean, this is a very different thing to do, a very different framing and a very different action that I would take if I would be in such a place. So it does quite matter a lot how people frame their life experiences.
And if I may add to this, what I found so interesting in Sicily, it's 50 degrees by now in summer, and people don't speak about climate change. They say, oh, it's hot, and but this is sort of normal. I mean, I think some are also really concerned, but the general discourse is not about climate change and climate change adaptation. What is worrying is that there's more air conditioning now. But the obviously, I mean, of course the scenarios say that the Mediterranean is a hotspot of climate change. And I think the Mediterranean, also in terms of coastal issues, is not really, for sure not an icon of climate change.
No. And in my case, studies, for example, like this extreme weather events that I was studying for my PhD work. In Mexico was a very strong hurricane called Hurricane Isidore, and here the Elbe big flood in 2002, and they were coincident in both regions, and there were extreme events, and they were very mediatic, and they were considered as like the first time where climate change was mentioned. And in the cases in Monterrey, they just said, it doesn't matter if there's a hurricane or tropical storm, we don't care, it comes every year. Like we have to live with it, and we are adapted to it. And I was very surprised about this, because in Monterrey there's like a returning quote of 20 to 30 years, a big flood in the main river, which is connecting the whole city. And I was thinking to study that, but I came in these places, and they said, well, it's every year actually. Like there's seasonal rainfalls actually, and it's only, they don't really feel that there's something bigger coming because of this changing climate, no? But indeed, because of the soil sealing. Exactly.
But theoretically that could link into risk perception quite well, right?
Exactly.
So if you would discuss it on a more theoretical level, I think that would be certainly a very interesting line of research. It brings me to another topic that I think is very important in the context of perceptions and coping strategies with climate change, and this is knowledge and also epistemological questions. Maybe you could talk a bit about your experience with these big topics from your research. It is not just about the ways climate change is explained, it is also about risk perception, for instance, and how this is contextualized in particular life worlds, be that in the Pacific or be that in the urban in Mexico.
You want to start?
I think maybe here we are really happy also about our joint environmental justice perspective, because often knowledge can be, especially if you speak about risk, for example, can be very technically based. And if you have a risk, you build a seawall, for example. But if it comes to environmental justice, and this is our joint, not only research perspective, but we also have together founded a network of environmental justice. Here it's really about justice questions, also of these solutions that we often see today. So mitigation and adaptation measures have a lot of justice implications. So all the politics that we have for climate change have a lot of justice implications. And often we don't see this in these technical measures, and also in the measures that are based on knowledge that is very, very natural science or technically driven. But yeah, I think in our case we are both. Yeah, we both agree that knowledge should be very much inclusive and looking, for example, at what the people of Kiribati say and what the people in Monterrey say, and explore their perspectives and also their worldviews.
Yeah, I think it's about changing the perspective, not to the to look what people affected by this kind of everyday catastrophes think and how they cope, what are their strategies, and to think that this is also knowledge. No, this everyday knowledge, everyday practices are also knowledge, and it's very common that risk atlas they just take into consideration these biophysical conditions and also geographical conditions, or they just take this very natural science oriented perspectives on social vulnerability. And this is quite problematic if you think, if you take into account this kind of knowledge and this kind of perspectives that are more social oriented or more, and of course, I think the justice implications of all this, no? Also,
what are justice implications? How would you describe? It sounds so abstract. It's a justice implication, but what precisely do you mean when you talk about justice implications?
Well, for me, it has everything to do with inequalities, and especially gender inequalities. I think gender is a very important determinant in social inequality, but also other categories, no? Especially age is also very important for justice. Different groups are differently impacted by climate change, and also, for example, by these micro disasters. No, it's very different to have little kids, or to have little children, or to be elderly, and I think that's very important. Also, migration backgrounds are quite important. And other categories which are also important, and I really try to keep an eye on this intersectional perspective on environmental justice, which is normally framed in terms of distribution in the space of harms and goods, or issues of recognition, issues of distribution and participation, no? Which is also important. But I always try to make it more complex with these categories.
Mm-hmm. But drawing on this discussion of justice, it brings me to the question of governance. How should, in your view, which might be quite different from the Pacific or from the urban, in particular a Mexican urban in a marginalized neighborhood, how should a climate governance look like that would be effective and that would maybe address also issues of justice and gender?
In Mexico or in?
Well, of either.
I mean, I was when I did my research actually on climate mobility in Kiribati, I started to look a lot on climate change adaptation measures because it was so obvious that all this money was a game changer in Kiribati. Like we really had a reframing of development, of so-called development programs, from, for example, domestic violence to climate change adaptation. So it became obvious that from programs that were concerned with social topics, adaptation programs were financed, that, for example, build new infrastructures, seawalls, and so on. Often the people said, these seawalls are also not really of good quality. You could see that they fall apart also. So we could see that this money was often also invested in a way that the Western experts came in and they built these seawalls and these infrastructures, and it was not so much the people on the ground that were involved.
Who probably would have built maybe mangroves or something else,
Yeah,
right? This is kind of often the case that they're...
And as you said, it's also justice of recognition a lot, so who's the expert actually? And I saw really a lot of consultants flying into Kiribati, complaining about that there's no good cappuccino, and doing a lot of money in 2-3 days, and then flying out again.
Well, money alone is not the solution, that is clear. So the question goes into governance strategies. How could they look like in terms of dialoguing? What kind of measures could you imagine that are needed, or would you suggest that are needed to do precisely not what you are saying, but to kind of draw more on the affordabilities of the environment, what is actually there? Mangrove is a typical example, but there may be also others. And I think this is in particular relevant to these micro catastrophes, as we have heard from
and
the urban context, where it's really a very different setting.
Well, to this last question, I will say, in the case of Mexico, I see like 2 points which are important. One is implementation. Mexico, maybe you know, is one of the was one of the first countries to sign a national plan, which is totally not being implemented. No, it's not going into the ground. That's a big problem. We have incredible laws, environmental laws in Mexico, but the issue of implementation is quite tough still. And well, I think that's one important point. And the other is, well, of course, the little importance in terms of budget that is given to climate change policy, but also in general to environmental policy.
But that might change in Mexico now with a new government.
Yeah, let's see.
Could well be the case.
I'm also quite curious about this.
We'll
and and the other thing is like the consideration of different actors. And I think one actor that is not being considered at all is like the factual powers, no? Which are unfortunately quite connected to the powerful non-state actors, like organized crime and drug cartels, which is not, they cannot be overseen. They are completely important for not only the informal economy, but also for formal economy.
I would fully agree.
Nowadays, especially real estate. They are investing a lot in real estate in the cities in Mexico, and also in other economic activities.
So it goes already into city planning as well. I mean, these kind of structures that are hard to detect and hard to negotiate it with, because they're kind of semi-official, but they're still very influential and important. And that's maybe something that is strong in the majority world or in the global south, where you have to deal with different forces than in the global north in terms of implementing measures or governance structures and so forth. I have to keep time a bit, and I think we should open the discussion for questions from the audience, if there are any. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. When you said that, Professor Chavez-Rodriguez, when you said that it's more like an internal phenomenon, than a cross-boarding one. It's well, you use the example of Mexico. I didn't totally understood. The Mexico, it's usually a destiny, not a like a cross country. I think that could be. I don't know. I thought it was more related to a geopolitical negotiation with the states, more than a climate thing. But on the other hand, it's like we see that not everyone that is in a place affected by climate migrate.
Yeah.
Like, so it's only a percentage of them. But not because of that, we challenge that climate issues are like a real problem. So in the same way, I think it's not the same that cross-boarding migration because of climate. It's also a percentage and not something that is not like the rule or something that is not happening because internal migration is like the higher number.
Well, I have not the precise figures, which are also really contested, as we have learned from Professor Klepp. What we find there, of course, we have both forms of human mobility, as internal one, as also cross-bordering mobility, human mobility, and well, what is happening? For example, Mexico was a traditional country of transit, and what is happening now, what we can see, is a process of bordering, of externalization of the U.S. borders to Tapachula, to the south border of Mexico, which and this is one, and the other is in the zone of the Darien, this triangle of Darien. Maybe you have heard about it in
it's
Central
very
America.
Prominent in the press in Germany
exactly.
as well. The
And yeah, so the experts on migration are speaking of this externalization of borders, of process of bordering, which are actually quite effective biopolitic dispositives that are implemented on that other borders. And well, one of this is done in the second, like the second border of Mexico, which are big cities like Monterrey, Chihuahua, and other, like not in the very border or the administrative or political border, but the next big cities where lots of people are actually just staying. No? This is the international migration, but there's also this other human mobility, which I was talking about. This is the internal one. Yeah. I hope this answers.
There are a lot of more or less shades of grey, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we have more questions. Yes. Okay.
Thank you. While listening to your presentations, a certain incident came to my mind. This has to do with the idea of blame. I think it was your idea. Blame that has to do with moral implications and resulting injustices. The anecdote that came to my mind is a bit entangled. I work in the Amazon, and there the dry season and wet season due to climate change become ever more catastrophic. So a few years ago there was a particularly bad flood that in the big city of Manaus. And what happened is that evangelical preachers began to blame indigenous people, which they called pagans, as guilty of this cosmological, in their perspective, cosmological incidents. So my question is, do incidents of climate change implicate or have as consequences injustice in the sense of putting the blame on certain vulnerable portions of society? Also, are incidents of climate change transposed to cosmological hazards? So they trigger apocalyptic scenarios, and apocalyptic scenarios that trigger once again the blame game on certain groups of the society.
So yeah, what we basically have in Kiribati is on the Oceania, but not only there, of course, a growing number of Pentecost and evangelist Christs that speak about doomsday scenarios and the last days as generally more like the sin of the people, maybe not blaming indigenous people, but saying, yeah, we all have to watch out because this is because we are sinners, and that's what we can observe in the Pacific quite a lot also. And of course, it's not helpful.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's quite interesting. I think, well, what this blaming is like occulting is this root causes, no? And I think these political root causes are just invisibilized by blaming some particular groups, no? And well, I think at least in my case, people are really tired of being blamed, and these political responsibilities which are invisibilized. And well, I think research and these perspectives of environmental justice can help somehow to at least make visible these injustices. Yeah, but I don't. At least in my case, this religious perspective, it plays more a role for social cohesion. But I'm not aware that they are like taking any religious perspective on that. Yeah, on the issue, for example, of staying or relocating. Yeah, it plays a role, but in other senses.
So in this case, the marginalized become more marginalized because of climate change, because it adds to their blame, so to speak, that they do the right thing. Yes, please.
Yeah. I try to understand the dimension of the problem. So I'm a pediatrician, so the question is public health. Public health is how many people are affected and what's the dimension of the effect. So if I look at I'm missing the definition of a climate migrant. So if I look at somebody in Mexico, for example, or a similar country, if it's not raining, then they have problems with farming. So for example, in Zimbabwe at the moment, they don't have any food at all, so they are migrating, for example, to South Africa. So that is clear, that is a climate migrant. But what's about Sicily? Sicily, it's getting very hot, 50 degrees in summer. I will not go there anymore as a tourist, and so the people working in tourism, they don't find a job, so they have to migrate as well somewhere else. If I go even further, it's not going to snow very much in Bavaria, so skiing areas have to close down. So these people will have to leave their areas. At the same time, it's becoming so hot in Vienna downtown that I might like to leave Vienna and move to the mountain area. So what is a climate migrant? What is your dimension and the economic effect? So how much does this cost the society, and what would be the cost benefit of coming in with interventions?
Yeah, and you put it perfectly on the point. I mean, I'm sure that we already have climate refugees from Bavaria in Kiel. I know that. Because I know that there are senior people that say it's taught for me now, and they move to the coast, you know. So, I mean, as you said, it's definitely extremely difficult, and we have none definition of the climate migrant, you know. And of course, it's not said that these people that have maybe less tourists will move. Maybe they put more air condition. That's what they do right now, you know. So it's we see that it's a field of research as migration generally that is absolutely not deterministic, because people are not always behaving in rationalist economic choices, for example. And this is actually, and we maybe go back to the title that we also both adapted a little bit. This is why we don't have global scenarios and global answers, but we have situated scenarios, situated research, local and maybe regional contexts and scenarios, and we have to really look at the cases, so to say, at the different regions, at the different conditions, and of course, most of the times, migration decisions are mixed decisions.
Yeah. But
I
I
just
think
wanted to say
it's a
that.
very important comment, and I
really liked it, yeah.
I alluded to the categorization a bit when I contrasted the label of economic migrant with climate refugee, which is contested, as you showed in your own example. And at times, I have the feeling, because it's not a kind of really a proof, that there's a strong political interest and a political connotation that goes along with it, and that has also to do with racialization, that often people from the global south are seen as economic migrants in the very first place, and when they're labeled as such, it's a completely different discourse in the broader social societies that arises, and when you say this is a climate refugee. So I think there is also this kind of more subtle political tendencies that we have to consider, just because there is no clear definition, or it depends on your perspectives how you define somebody. Is that a climate refugee or is it an economic migrant? And the connotation of this and the legal status that goes along with it are completely different. So it's a very important field of further research, I would say, this type of classification, and it needs to be seen in the broader context of what is actually wanted, or who is wanted and who is not wanted. Exactly. And that would then also probably shift the categories a bit, I could imagine. Yes?
Yes, sorry, another question. According to your expertise, and I really value the ethnographic method, and it's when we, the international paradigm about cross-border, like climate displacement, is established that usually someone is affected by climate, then there's mobility inside the country or in the region. Mm-hmm. But it's and they consider the traditional reports that it stops there. That's the whole story. New evidence is showing that the next step is the cross-border thing. Basically, the most easy explanation is like in the global south, when the public efforts, they are not helping enough to these communities in their homeland. Mm-hmm. So the problem when they go to an urban area that is not that affected, they still don't have the resources for helping like these migrants. So they have to look for other options where they will receive this help. So my question is, which difference can you see between the people affected by climate in urban areas and the rural areas? Like if you see differences or I don't know, what can you say about it?
I don't know if I understand the question. So you mean people that migrated to urban areas and to rural areas?
Yeah, because it's like some people are affected in urban areas and rural. Usually displacements are traditionally from rural to urban areas. Mm-hmm. So the question is like if you can see a difference between the how people is affected, like psychologically, socially, or in inequalities in these two areas, like in the cities or.
I mean, I would say that in the rural areas, of course, sometimes you have livelihoods that are very much based on weather and farming, for example, as our colleague said. For example, if you have strong droughts and for more years you cannot farm your land, you have, of course, huge problems. And but if you migrate is another question often, and this is what we know from empirical research. You know that it's really a mixed decision, and At the beginning of the debate, we had a lot of speaking about these numbers, but in the last years we moved away a little bit from the numbers and more concentrating on the empirical research on different places and regions also.
And what you also see is that people diversify their economy much more than they did before.
Maybe transit and then they go back.
And important strategy in many areas.
Yeah, migration is only
circular
one of the
migration.
No? It's one of the strategies if there's degradation of natural resources as water, or not only degradation but also contamination. There are like different problematics, but I think I agree with this idea that migration is always multifactorial. No, it's not one factor that is determinant, but is often related to this degradation of natural environment, and is maybe not the first thing you said when you migrate. And for example, there's people working on securitization and militarization of the U.S. borders. They said that it's when you go deeper into the explanations, they are often they commonly show up some environmental reasons to migrate. Maybe not directly climate change, but for example, extreme phenomena in Latin America is very important. For example, people from Haiti, or people from even from Venezuela.
But Haiti, I think, is also perfect.
It's a
case because
they
you
wouldn't say climate change necessarily, but they would say political reasons.
Yeah,
and
you have Domrep, and you have Haiti together, and the Republic, the Dominican Republic, nearly nobody migrates.
Like they have to keep time a bit, and we have at least 2 more questions. Yes, Gordon and.
I was fascinated by your question, Silja, on do we need scenarios? Partly because in our round of questioning, scenarios have come up implicitly several times. Do we know how many migrants we're going to have? Do we know where they're coming from and where they're going to? But also, how hot is it going to be? And do we know what that heat really means? Does it mean, as in New Zealand, that you're going to have a slower moving cyclone that's more intense than before because the ocean has heated up, and that means your storm is going to be even more damaging than you ever expected? I put it to you that we do need scenarios.
We need these scenarios, the weather scenarios.
We need more than that. We need them because we need to know about our capacities. Are they up to it? So I'm not sure what you would like to...
No, totally. I really love this question because I'm discussing it a lot with my modeling and scenario building colleagues, exactly in the field of climate migration. And as I did research in this field, I would say regarding mobility of people, I found scenarios counterproductive because we have so many different factors and insecurities in this that I think, we should have scenarios regarding the heat, regarding the weather, but I'm not sure that we should talk about. I mean, we had this discussion of Myers that he said already in the 90s, we already have 50 million refugees, climate refugees, and we will have 500 million in the future. But it was somehow meaningless, his colleague said also, Richard Black mostly, when we had this minimalist versus maximalist debate at the very beginning of the climate migration debate. So these numbers were very much deconstructed, actually, but they remained with us forever. So this is actually also the problem of scenarios, I think. The public and the policymakers are very happy about them, and they very much concentrate on these numbers, and they think this is viable knowledge, speaking in terms of knowledge, but I'm not sure that it helps us in this regard.
Okay, we have another question.
I want to come back to your comment about urban areas. Don't get me wrong if I talk about mosquitoes first. I come back to humans. The mosquito, the Aedes, is spreading in Europe because it's getting warmer and it's getting more humid. But depending on the scenario, in 50 years, it could be that it's decreasing again because it's getting too hot or too dry or too humid. And it's the same with humans. We only have a very, very limited temperature tolerance. So our body wants 37 degrees. If it's very humid outside, 32 degrees can already be too hot. So it could be that in Jakarta, for example, if the temperature is continuously on 35 degrees and 90% humidity, that the human creature cannot adapt anymore. So going from rural areas to urban areas, it could become from urban areas to rural areas, because urban areas are heat islands.
Yes.
So I contradict you. I think we need scenarios to plan.
I think you're not the only one who would contradict that. There is kind
No,
of
but I'm saying there is a limit of adaptation. And heat, we cannot adapt. In Sicily, 50 degrees, okay, we might have the money to go into climatized rooms. But looking at low and middle income countries and the population, especially in high density areas in the megacities, in the global south, around the equator, they will not be able to adapt. So I think policymakers do need these scenarios to prepare for what's coming.
a very brief answer because we are over time already.
Yeah,
And we have
okay, just
more
very
questions.
quickly. I think it's also like a question of infrastructural resilience, what you are talking about. For example, I'm just telling a very little anecdote about Monterrey in the last year. We had around 50 degrees, and nobody expected that the electricity system just collapsed because everybody was putting on the air conditioners. And we had 5 days of no electricity in a city of 5.7 million. And you can imagine what people did. So the whole refrigerator, the food was go wrong, but people were going to the natural places to have more
Outside
fresh
of the
water,
city,
to
yeah.
escape it from the heat. No? And this was really interesting. Or started to sleep on the floor, or putting some water on the floor, and like different strategies. And this was really interesting. But I think for those things we need scenarios, and we need the, for example, research on resilience. But for these infrastructural things, and of course I totally agree with the mosquitoes, with the vectors, no vector illnesses. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you for
we
the
have
question.
one more question and then we will.
It's just one question about money, because if there is a lot of people migrating inside the countries, and very often it's in the poorer countries, I think they do need some financial support from the richer countries. Is this also an aspect you are looking into, that matter?
I have a very dear colleague who's really looking into climate adaptation financing and justice questions linked to it. Yeah, and of course, one part of climate justice is also who is financing, for example, who's financing the measures. Do we speak about loss and damage? And then it's a totally different question than if we speak about voluntary donor money in terms of adaptation.
And just in terms of adaptation to help the people to survive.
Yeah. But if we, but I mean, for example, if we speak about coastal infrastructures, it's just impossible to build seawalls around 32 islands. Yeah, so big questions.
Yeah, very limited answers, I would say, to those big questions.
And always part of the global, the UNFCCC talks also, no? Just recently also. And yeah, you know that there were also rising a lot of question marks in this.
Yeah, I think we can continue our discussion. We have to continue our discussions about also very controversial topics and about the future, but also what we can learn from the past. I think also historians could come to our table to talk with us about certain scenarios from the past, what we can learn from the future, for instance. But this is maybe a topic for another round table. So thank you all very much for being here, and thank you very much for your input and for coming to Mexico to offer your perspective and to share this with us. I think that was really very interesting, and I would maybe also appreciate a more interdisciplinary dialogue that we can create, and our research topic and our research group here at the CAS is precisely doing that, bringing together very, very different perspectives and to try to tackle at least some of the aspects that we covered also in this discussion round. So thank you very much for being here, and thank you for coming, and thank you very much to the CAS for enabling us to be here and to have that conversation. Thank you.